So welcome everyone to another episode of Accounting for Old Cars, and today I'm just going to give you a quick walk around Bess, my 1971 Mark II Vitesse. This was something which was requested by one of my subscribers, and just give you a little bit of an explanation about the Vitesse itself as a model, and take this car on a little drive later to test out the new gearbox which has just been fitted, and there's a story behind that which I'll go into in a little while. And I hope to give you a bit of history, personal history of this car and how it was I came to acquire her. So the obvious place to start is with the engine with this car, as this is really the heart of any Vitesse. And as you'll see, the bonnet helpfully folds forward to give you unrivaled access both to the engine, front suspension and the brakes, as you can sort of see here. Of course, we're looking at a straight 6-cylinder 2-litre engine. This is the engine that found its way into the standard Vanguard 6, and then of course to that car's successor, the big 2000 saloon. But you can see in this car, this is running twin SUs. Now, this is a sort of fairly popular conversion. Some people dislike the Stromberg carburetors, and I've heard people sort of complain that they're difficult to balance and to maintain. I think there are all sorts of different experiences among owners and mechanics. But what's happened here is it looks as though the whole sort of assembly of SU carburetors and inlet manifold have been lifted probably from a later 2000 or 2.5 litre twin carburetor saloon, and have simply just been bolted onto this engine block. So this is one modification which sets this particular car apart from most of the other Mark IIs. The other thing that you'll notice is, again, this is a common upgrade. It has K&N air filters, and just over the engine block on the other side there's an aftermarket servo which has been fitted as well. I've upgraded a little bit in the sense that I've swapped out the original dynamo for an alternator, and that allows me to run the windshield wipers, the headlights, and to charge a phone or a sat nav at the same time. So it seems to sort of work out much better that way from my point of view. This car's also had a Record radiator, and that certainly has been much better at keeping the engine cool in traffic. And you'll notice on this one it still runs the fan on the end of a crank. Just looking at the bulkhead, as you might expect, we've got clutch and brake master cylinders, next to that windscreen wiper motor and washer bottle. And on this car, the windscreen wipers are an improved design, so the spindles are set further apart on the bulkhead, which just gives a much better sweeping pattern, and a much clearer swept area on the passenger side. We'll just have a quick look at the bonnet catches. The little M, and I think I probably showed you this in one of my other videos with the Mark I, but the M here is the only clue that this car was styled by Michelotti, and obviously the M is for Michelotti. And then the badge next to it, which says 2 litre on the Mark I, here of course denotes that this is a Mark II. So we'll just bring the bonnet down, and you can see again on this car we've got these sort of wide slat grills instead of the traditional grill seen on the 1600 and the 2 litre. The difference again between this car and the early cars, the Triumph script, which would normally be across the bonnet, that's gone, replaced instead by a rather simple and elegant enamel Vitesse badge. That's period correct. the Triumph emblem on the other hand, or the standard Triumph emblem, is not correct, and someone's added that as a kind of ornament. I think it looks quite attractive, but purists will tell you that is not where it should be. And then as we sort of come back, interesting upgrade on this car also is the lower valance, and this actually is an aftermarket fiberglass fitment, which is also repeated at the back. From this distance it's actually difficult to tell, but what I can say is that in period these areas of a car rusted out pretty quickly, so it was, I think, a popular upgrade in the 1980s, and it's just one less thing for me to worry about. You saw under the engine, you saw under the bonnet that the car has stainless steel exhaust manifold or headers, and these sort of emerge as a bifurcated stainless steel sports exhaust at the back here. Wheels on this car, these again have been changed, so we've got wider, taller radial tyres sitting on these Minilite copies. A lot of people like these. I've got to be honest and say I think the original steel wheels with the Ross style effect hubcaps suit the car better, but I've no doubt these are superior in terms of quality, and they make a difference, I'm sure, to the handling. The other thing just to note, you probably saw that the red coil springs at the front denote a slightly lowered stance. I'm not sure about that. I think the disadvantage with the lowering of the front suspension and these wider wheels means that the steering is much heavier and the whole car feels much more planted, which is good in the corners. But compared to my Mark 1, this is, if you like, a solid and competent ballroom dancer compared to the light and effortless ballerina that is Tess, my 1967 2-litre. So this is really where the Vitesse and the Herald differ. Everything from the bulkhead forward. Inside, the signature Triumph wooden dashboard, these lovely sort of wooden cappings here. The dashboard in Bess here is the original. As far as I can tell, it hasn't been touched, and this creates a bit of a dilemma for me because the lacquer is starting to come off, and I'm really in two minds whether to just try to preserve the originality of the car and live with the peeling lacquer, or whether to go in, have it completely refurbished, which is what happened to my Mark 1, or just to try to make localized repairs. And because I can't decide, I've just taken the safe option and done nothing at all. Again, sort of just having another look at the dashboard, you'll notice that if you compare the dashboard on this car with the Mark 1, in the name of safety, obviously we're starting to think about safety in the 1970s, and so the stalks are the heater control. So we've got heat direction, so this is either your feet or the windshield. You pull these out, that's the blower fan for the heater. Light switch, pull that out, and then you adjust on the stalk whether you want main beam dipped or side lights, and then choke just there. These have been sensibly recessed so that they don't impale you in the event of an impact. An interesting idea. This car has had the original steering wheel changed for a motor litre, and in doing so someone has moved the horn from its traditional position in the centre of the steering wheel just down to here, and it also has a useful charging point for mobile phone or sat nav. The rest of the interior, again, we've got the sort of typical sort of vinyl seats. These are the correct style for the car, but they're not original to this car. And certainly what isn't original are the cards here on the back seats. They are typical of the style, but they're not quite right. And my suspicion is that actually the interior seats and possibly the door cards have come from a late Triumph Herald. And there are a number of things about this car that don't sort of quite add up. So the first thing is that you'll notice it has this sort of quite attractive sage green sort of grey colour to it. This is a non-standard colour. Triumph certainly didn't produce anything in this shade, and to get touch-up paint I had to have the car scanned and have it sort of mixed professionally. Just down here on the engine below by the carburetors, you might be able to see there's a patch of white, and that I think is the original chassis colour. And I've got a photograph of the car being pulled out of the barn in about 1999, and it is indeed white. That is how it was from the factory. And so the likelihood is that the original interior would have probably been black. That seemed to be the sort of most popular interior combination with white. A couple of other things. On the boot of this car, the Mark II Vitesses had this sort of aluminium inset panel, really as part of this sort of final facelift, and there was this sort of new Triumph script here, and then in the sort of brow over the top of a reversing light, the Vitesse logo. What they didn't have was the Triumph lettering. That had gone by the Mark II. And so what we're looking at is the boot lid from a different car. And it's quite possible this came from an earlier Vitesse, but it might equally have come from a Herald. What I should say is, if you notice that there is a difference in continuity, or a problem with the continuity here, it is quite simply I managed to delete the first part of this video, and so this film is actually shot several days apart, so I can't quite remember what the crops around me looked like, or whether they had ploughed the field at that point when I shot it the first time. But those of you who are eagle-eyed will no doubt have spotted that it doesn't quite fit together as it might otherwise. In terms of performance, what we know is that the Mark I 2-litre had an output of about 95 brake horsepower. This one, with the revised cylinder head that came along with the Mark II, and I understand that the cylinder head was a version of the TR5 head, and that raised the horsepower to about 105. Clearly the old swing axle suspension, which had sort of come from the Herald, was never going to be able to cope adequately with that kind of power delivery. I mean, the Mark I, arguably, the Mark I 2-litre was sort of at its limit at that point in 67. So by 1968, when this came out, there was a revision to the rear suspension, and what that meant was that the swing axle was fitted with lower wishbones. We'll have a little look underneath and see if there's any chance that you can see it, but you might just be able to see here, but the right at the bottom of the suspension there are lower wishbones, and that sort of stops the wheels from tucking under, so you're able to push the car right the way through a corner rather than having to do the old sort of slow in fast out routine. So one of the other things that I ought to just explain, in case it's not obvious, this car has 4 forward speeds, so literally first, second, third, fourth. Reverse is sort of across, down and up like that. But overdrive is on the stalk, and overdrive works on third and fourth gear, and that's a really useful addition here. The most recent job that we've had done, and the reason that this car hasn't sort of appeared on the channel for about a month, is because of the gearbox. And I think what happened was there was a failure of the clutch master cylinder on the last drive that we did, actually, when David brought the car to the Friston car show. And I think the clutch wasn't disengaging fully, and as a consequence of that, it managed to lunch the synchromesh on second gear. It was actually so bad that no amount of double declutching would get the car into gear on the move. So many thanks to John and David at Anglian Triumph Services at Ditchingham for their efforts, and they were able to swap out the old gearbox with a reconditioned one in a matter of a few days. And today is the first day of the car back with me with its new gearbox. So we're going to take her for a little spin and just run through the gears and just see how she is. Obviously I've managed to drive her from Ditchingham back to home, and it all seems absolutely fine. As with a lot of new gearboxes, it's a little bit stiff, but I think it'll just take a bit of time for everything just to lap in. And at the moment I'm being a little bit gentle with my gear changes, but that's a lovely action actually, from first to second, then up into third, and yeah, going up the box feels absolutely wonderful. These gearboxes, I think it's fair to say, really are the Achilles heel of these cars, because they're based on the original gearbox of the Triumph Herald, which was, of course, designed originally for a 1 litre engine, and certainly not intended to have 100 brake horsepower put through them. A really good solution, I think, would have been to have fitted the gearbox from the TR4, a much more robust unit. But I'm told that the width between the chassis rails was the thing that really restricted the choice on gearboxes. I'm sure other people have been able to cut the chassis and adapt them, but that hasn't happened here. Just drop her into third. Yeah, that's very, very nice. So having two Vitesses seems sort of an unlikely choice. And the truth is that this particular car belonged to a friend of mine called Tony, and Tony is a lovely chap. Actually, I met him when he was one of my clients in my former occupation, and I got to know Tony over a period on and off of about 20 years. And when he retired, he decided what he wanted to do was, like a lot of us, to sort of relive an earlier part of his life. And he had owned a convertible Triumph Herald, wanted to have that experience, but I think thought that it would be difficult to do the kind of driving he wanted to do, long distance touring in a Herald, and felt that actually a Vitesse would be much better suited to the sort of roads that he wanted to drive on. He opted for a Vitesse, and he knew that I owned one, asked me a little bit of or asked me for a little bit of advice about the business of owning and driving these cars, and I encouraged him to get one. I told him how much I loved my car and how much fun and how much pleasure it had given me, and so he was able to locate this car and buy it. But what I didn't know at the time was that Tony was actually not very well, and as his illness sort of progressed and took hold, he was able to drive the car less and less, and in the end it meant him having to move away from Suffolk to another part of the country to be closer to sort of family support networks. And he approached me out of the blue and told me he wanted me to have the car. And I think part of it was because he knew how well I looked after my own Vitesse, and I think he really wanted this to go to a home where it would be used and where it would be really appreciated. And so we struck up a deal, and I took Bess over last summer, and I explained to Tony that I had this ambition to use her for film work, which we've been doing, and also for the visits to some of the care homes. And you'll see in my channel there's a film about one of those visits and an explanation as to why we did that. But there's a part of me that still feels that this is Tony's car, and sadly Tony's no longer with us, and every time I go out in this car I sort of always think about Tony, and I think about Tony's wife and his family, and it's a very nice way to remember him, and it's also nice to be able to share this car in a way that I know Tony would appreciate. And you know, when I get comments from viewers and subscribers who tell me that they've enjoyed seeing some of the films, you know, that I've made in this car, I think how happy that would make Tony to know that Bess sort of lives on in another life and is bringing pleasure to other people, and that she's visible, she's out on the roads being used and enjoyed. But because of that link with Tony, it makes it much more difficult for me to make decisions about making changes to this car, because this is the car that he loved. You know, he loved the colour. I think, you know, everything about the car is what Tony liked about in terms of the colour scheme inside. And some of these things about the car, you know, the bonnet badge, the script on the boot lid, which is not technically correct, but these are all things that were important to him, and therefore I think they should be kept, you know, sort of in honour of you know, his taste and enjoyment. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a real pleasure just to walk you around Bess and to tell you a little bit about the history of this particular car, a little bit about Tony, and also to bring you with me just to try out the new gearbox, which I have to say is everything I hoped it would be. We'll just pop her into overdrive quickly. Beautifully smooth. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Take care.